Our next presenter is Dr. Stephanie Larson from U.S. Cooperative Extension, Sonoma County. Dr. Larson is the Director of California Cooperative Extension, promotes research and extension programs in Sonoma County, along with being a livestock and range management advisor. She addresses climate change, food production, and ecological and economical management of working landscapes in Sonoma and Marin counties. She has a BS and an MS in animal science and a PhD in range management. And I will let you tell the rest of your story. Welcome.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you all very much. It's always so nice to come to these conferences and just really get to know people and share experiences. And I have to agree, Mary, that was a wonderful video, and I think it's something that kind of gives us all inspiration as we look forward and move forward. So I am with Cooperative Extension, and I get the privilege of working with producers, many like yourself, and I work with all types of producers, as I say, the producers of four legs. And in 2017, we had a catastrophic fire in Sonoma County, and it was the Tubbs and Nuns fire. It took out 5,000 homes, and we've never had anything like that. And so my whole career, I've always been pushing grazing as a management tool. And after those catastrophic fires, I thought, and I worked with the fire professionals, and I said, had we grazed all of these areas in the WUI, would it have saved these homes? And they said, well, given it was a 90-mile-an-hour winds, probably not. But it might have slowed them down. It might have given us another chance. And so it really just moved my focus to look at how do we implement grazing from a fire perspective, and how do we manage our vegetation through that lens. And so I came up with this idea with some assistance, Match.Graze, and I like to call it my dating service for cows or sheep or goats, whatever animal you want to date, to get people's attentions. And it happened to be at a time when we had a president who had a hat that said MAGA on it, and I came upon the idea of having a hat that says MAGA on it as well, but it's Make America Graze Again. So I want to share with you what I've done along those lines. So this isn't something new, but we all, from an extension perspective, I need to educate the public as well and educate the landowners that weren't grazing. And so it's for them to understand that grazing is natural. It happens with wild and domesticated animals. Along with fire, it's one of the oldest vegetation management tools that we have, and it can change the communities, the plant communities. And so understanding what the goals of the landscape are and what you want that landscape to look like, whether it's from a reduction of fire, fuels, or whether it's from a biodiversity or a special status species or whatever, we can use grazing to achieve those goals. So when we talk about vegetation management, people look at all the different tools. And I'm not saying we shouldn't use all the tools, because I think we should. But what I'm really interested in is really using grazing as that tool. But we have to recognize that with all the tools in our toolbox, we have to think about the cost, the availability, the access, the practicality of those tools, the policies that allow us to use those tools, the social acceptability, and the environmental impacts. And so when I look at grazing through those points, you have to kind of start to be able to answer the questions to the public or to the landowners that aren't familiar with grazing. And maybe they think about, well, I want to use prescribed grazing or prescribed fire, or maybe I want to use hand tools or mechanical tools. And so we have to kind of sell it in a way that make people understand grazing and see it through a variety of different tools and uses. So when we think about grazing as the objective, we can use grazing on range and pasture lands. We could also use grazing in forested lands. And so if you're wanting to reduce the amount of chemicals or the herbicides, we can use grazing to do that, so that we can reduce those applications, and that those might then improve the water resources, quality, different things like that. If you think about mechanical, we can't avoid the fact that when we're driving our tractor or a masticator or things like that, we're going to have a higher fuel cost. It's going to depend on the weather, and it's going to release those carbon emissions into the air. So we want to start to sell this kind of big picture about the whole climate thing. It's going to reduce the labor cost. There's obviously labor to run grazing animals, but these other tools also require labor, particularly prescribed fire. And from a soil quality perspective or soil health, it's really important that we can sell that story that using grazing animals can improve the soil quality through enticing the perennial systems to put more roots down, to provide more biodiversity options, and to look at manure or compost applications on those lands. And so that leads us to a breakdown of why graze. And in order to get more people to graze, we have to educate folks of why do we graze, what would we do that? So we can graze, as I mentioned, to reduce the use of chemicals or mechanical equipment. We can do targeted grazing and have people to understand the use of animals from a specific goal or a resource goal. Extension, it's really important for me to help people understand what their goals are and help them to achieve those goals, but they're their goals. And so it's helping them to understand, okay, if you're going to use them for grazing from a fuel perspective, from a managing vineyards or orchards, kind of a thing of where you apply grazing and what type of grazing animal do you apply with the choosing of the livestock. We have a lot of people very interested in goats. They always want goats. And I always kind of smile thinking you've probably never worked with goats. I think goats are great, but they can be difficult to work with. And so it's this idea of, but they're scared of cows because cows are bad. And so it's trying to better understand where are they coming with that information and how can I help them better understand which species and when. So, and you guys all know this, but again, it's important that we kind of get everybody on the same playing field, a better understanding how you break down grazing. So we're looking at from a labor perspective. We need trained laborers. We need to help the next generation better understand grazing. We need to have the ability so that these folks not only can work with animals, but just like the previous video showed about how they interact with the public, how they tell their message. We have a lot of interaction on public lands, on park lands in California, where we've got 1 million visitors to those parks every year. We need to have the grazers be able to talk to the folks and talk about their animals and tell their story and be comfortable doing that. It also costs money to haul and move animals, so how do we help folks to either move their animals without the equipment, or how do we get the equipment to some of our startup people and how to move those animals in the most humane way possible? And this whole idea about grazing animals year-round, we always have a kind of a thought in California is that, you know, people want grazing during a certain season, and then there's this myth of where the animals go after that. It's like we just don't put them on a shelf and wait till the grazing season starts again. They need a home ranch or some place where they can go back to. And so if you have targeted grazers, you've got to figure that into your grazing management of where you put the animals when the grazing season isn't happening. And this has been discussed a couple of times, and I think it's really important that we think about nutrition and then the idea of toxic plants. So we've seen some concerns in California about when we're out targeted grazing, people are concerned about the health or the welfare of the animals, that maybe the nutritional needs of those animals aren't being met. And so that's because the timing when they can get in to graze isn't the time when the nutrition is the highest. And so it's helping landowners to better understand how can they maintain that level of nutrition in their animals from a welfare standpoint, from a production standpoint, but yet achieve the goals of brush reduction or, you know, fire mitigation. And so, and then educating the public of please don't throw over your lawn clippings just to, you know, save you from taking them someplace else, because the animals might graze them and they might be toxic to the animals. Predation is a huge issue in California. We have coyotes, mountain lions, bears, and I'm sure you all have your own versions of predators. And so how do we deal with that, whether it's guarding animals, you know, if we're in an urban area, do those animals bark all night, the guarding animals, and how do we reduce predation and the logistics of that, and of course the animal welfare. People are watching, people being landowners, the public are watching. They may not be that supportive of livestock grazing in general, and so they're always watching to see if those animals are well cared for, if there's shade, if they have the nutritional needs, etc. So I'm spinning this in a little bit to kind of build the story up of we also need to sell grazing from a climate perspective. And so there are many things that we can talk about, and that there's the biogenic carbon cycle that we have been pushing in California that talks about how we implement grazing to achieve this nice carbon recycling. We all know that if we graze better, we're going to store more water, we're going to have better soil health, our microbiome in our soil is much better, and that's going to sequester the carbon that helps reduce the GHG emission. As I mentioned, fire was a huge issue in California, as it is in a lot of the West states too, and grazing is that tool could help to mitigate that. And from a weed perspective or an invasive species perspective, grazing could also be that tool that helps us to maintain the biomass, the biodiversity that we want on those landscapes. So I put this in so we can all kind of get on this page of greenhouse gases. And we have at UC Davis the CLEAR Center that's really been pushing this so people to better understand, because maybe you've heard that ruminants produce methane, might have crossed your, in front of you. And so we have to kind of get out ahead of that and not be catching up and not having to, beg forgiveness, if you will. We have to acknowledge that, yes, ruminants produce methane. That's what they do, and that's domestic and wildlife. And so we look at the carbon dioxide will last in the atmosphere 1,000 years, methane lasts in the atmosphere 10 years, and nitric oxide, another gas, will last about 110 years. So with that, we have to kind of point out that methane occurs. There's natural and there's man-made type methane emissions kind of thing. And we have fossil fuels production and use will produce methane. Obviously, agriculture and waste does. Burning produces methane. And then we have kind of what we call natural. So our wetlands, our lakes, if you have termites, they're all producing methane. So methane is produced. And so it's a gas that is going to occur naturally in the atmosphere. So where does that fit into from a fire perspective? Because people are very concerned and very aware of fires. So this was an analysis looking at greenhouse gases, wildfire, and grazing in California. And so if you're going to burn 1,000 pounds of forage, air-dried forage, you're going to produce 5 pounds of particulates in the air, and our air quality has been completely destroyed with fires. And what it produces in the CO2 is about 1829 pounds of CO2 and 2 pounds of methane. So that's what a fire could produce. Now, if we relate that to grazing and say now we're grazing 1,000 pounds of forage, so the same amount. So we've only produced 375 pounds of the CO2. Now we have produced 5 times the amount of methane, but a lot less of the nitric oxide. So from a comparison, there's a lot more CO2 that goes into the air when we have a fire as opposed to when we're grazing. So how we can relate that from a perspective of how do we increase more grazing opportunities is I'm starting to really look at grazing lands in Sonoma. This is my county, Sonoma County, north of San Francisco, and then looking at the whole Bay Area. So that takes into account all San Francisco, San Mateo, a lot of the more urban areas. And we've got potential of grazing lands that may or may not be grazing of over 500,000 in Sonoma County and over 2 million in the Bay Area. And so thinking about how we might look at these different types of vegetation, I mean, obviously we're not going to get a lot of vegetation or grazing off barren rock, but it's areas that we could have animals on, and maybe that by having animals on might improve the quality of the forage that's grown, but just really starting to focus on lands that aren't grazed and how we might implement grazing onto them. And so with that, I'm also looking at it from looking at COMET and the GHG emissions kind of thing, is kind of starting to document the amount of reductions we're going to see in GHG from grazing versus wildfires. So not to go into this, but it's just to look at kind of the methodology of how do we start telling the story about from a climate perspective on how grazing can reduce our GHG emissions and how we might better manage those lands in the future. So just to quickly go through the biogenic carbon cycle, and this is kind of by Botany 101, but we all know about CO2 in the atmosphere. It's captured through photosynthesis. It's stored in the soil through carbohydrates in the root systems. Along comes our grazing animal, whether it's cows or sheep or goats, and they graze that. They're going to produce methane. That's what they do when they're ruminants. And that methane then lasts in the atmosphere for 10 years, and then it recycles and becomes CO2. So that's why methane only lasts 10 years and the CO2 lasts over 1,000, because it doesn't break down. The only way it breaks down is through this photosynthesis process. So the more we graze, the better we graze, the deeper the soils, the more perennials that we have, the more capturing from that photosynthesis that we can do. So actually grazing is one of the keys to climate change. Not the fact that they produce methane, the fact that they graze a product that you and I can't utilize, but they produce a product that you and I can utilize in many ways. And so that's the biogenic carbon cycle. So from all of this, and this whole need to increase grazing and understanding there's all these lands out there, so then it's like that old saying, if you build it, will they come, kind of a thing. And so it was this idea of starting this site, Match.Graze, that would bring people, grazers, and landowners, whether it's public or private, together so that they could find each other, if you will. And again, I started this with the idea of kind of a parody off Match.Graze, so that it would catch their eye going, isn't that kind of a dating service? And it's like, yes, Match.Graze. Not. And so what it is, it's a free online platform that connects livestock producers with landowners throughout the state of California. And it helps you to pair up with animals or the land base. And with this service, we're obviously looking to help people have more grazing opportunities, to produce better habitat, to reduce our fire potential, and really just to kind of look at long-term production and in viability for our grazing operations. So how it started, did I mention we had a fire? We had a fire, and I said, I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm tired of watching it burn. We burned in 17, 19, 20. It was, and what I was seeing happen is that the collective we, reacted from losing 5,000 homes and didn't think about the vegetation. We thought about the homes and the people. Obviously, we lost lives too. And then there was all the other catastrophic fires around us. And so it was like, what I was seeing is that the vegetation that had burned in 17 grew back in 19, and it burned again. And the fire footprint in 20, again, from the 17 fire. And so we weren't learning on vegetation management from those things. And so I said, we've got to do something. Well, I just happened across, in that time frame, the South Dakota Grazing Exchange. They were focusing on their grazing exchange on soil health. And I thought, how great is that? They are recognizing that grazing can improve soil health. So I worked with them, used the same web developer, and we started Match.Graze, which very much is similar to what they have at the Grazing Exchange in South Dakota. Started Match.Graze as a way to increase all of the opportunities that grazing provides. And then I looked at it from a three-tier perspective. And I think this is where, you know, when we heard the previous speaker talk about scale and small scale, so sizes. So it's, as a grazing proponent, one size doesn't fit all, as you all know when you go into your operations. And so we look at a community size, and so we have people that will graze from property to property, never putting their animals on a truck. They'll run down a rural road, or they could move from adjacent properties. And so it's an opportunity for smaller scale people to get involved with a small herd, usually sheep and goats, and they're moving from place to place. Usually no money's exchanged. The neighborhood all works together. You get to know your neighbors. You have a barbecue at the end, probably with one of the grazers, and it's a really good opportunity. The next one we're all very familiar with, the targeted or the contract grazers, where we're helping people to provide a service. And so a lot of public lands managers will hire them to do that service. And so that's where the grazer is paid. And then the commercial grazer. So it's all three. So the commercial grazer being the traditional livestock grazers, so that that person will rent the property. So it's the idea of how do we, provide information for all three of those scales. So let's see if we are fortunate to, I don't know if we'll get to show the video. Oh, maybe. Oh, I'm seeing it, you're not. Okay. Darn. I'll tell you what it is. Yeah, I don't, you won't see it.
Come on, goats, goats!
Okay. Can I switch screens? That's a good idea.
So I've noticed on several fires, including some extreme fires, such as the tubs in the pocket, that a fire has more or less stopped at the edge of a...
I don't know how to do that. But if you go on Match.Graze, there's a video that starts with this gentleman who's with CAL FIRE. And CAL FIRE is our big fire agency in California. And his first comments is where I've seen fires and where I've seen them stop is he says at the edge of this fence post is the difference between whether they're grazed or not grazed. And so we've got the fire officials saying that grazing is the tool. So what this video goes through and talks about those three different scales. So you'll see the community scale, the targeted grazers that are paid, and then the commercial grazers that pay for that service. So I encourage you to go there and check it out. So, and if you're interested, and if you wanted to start your own Match.Graze in your state, it's very easy to do. You just get the website up there, and then what folks do is they create their own account. So they go online, if you're a goat grazer, and you go online and you make your own profile. So you could talk about how wonderful your goats are, their names, their this or their that, or how far you're willing to travel, maybe some testimonials of other places, maybe what you've charged, different things like that. So then you register and you get a little pin, and then you start grazing. So what that looks like on the website is, in February we launched this just late 2020 right into 2021. So in February 2021, we only had about 5 pins in there. So we had 5 people initially starting that saying, I have some cows, I have some goats, I have some sheep, and I'm down here in the Central Valley. This is the southern part in the middle of California. Here's the Central Valley. And now just last November, we have all of these pins. And so they're pins of grazing animals, but they're also pins of landowners. And so it's an interactive grazing map, so you can go in there and see where the pins are. You can scroll in, scroll out kind of a thing, and saying, okay, well, there's some goats near my hometown. And then I click on that pin, and it talks about the goats. There's a lot of information. There's an about page where you can watch these videos, the resources, and then a how to sign up for kind of a thing. And so that's what it will look like when you go on Match.Graze. And so after a year, as Extension does, I wanted to find out, well, how's it working? What is the survey? What are the folks telling me? And they actually want more scheduling. So they want more interaction. So it's not just, because it's static. It's like, here's my profile, and you have to go in and you have to contact me. So they want an ability to schedule. And that would be really good for the grazer themselves, because maybe they can start to have a map that says, I'm going to be in this area this time, and if you're really close, so we can start to build on that. So that kind of maps out for the grazer and for the landowner. They want to have it highlighted, so it's, on those websites, new to this website, or new to Match.Graze, Bob and his goats, kind of a thing. And they want further differentiation and more explanation about the 3 different terms or tiers, so community, targeted, and commercial. So again, obviously, this is right. You'd go on there now, and there'd be a pin, and it'd have a cell number, and so you might call that person. Well, maybe it goes to voicemail, and then you're playing phone tag. So they want more of ability to more of a chatting function, between the land bases and the grazers. Provide users with match suggestions, so it's kind of like, again, more information. So this whole idea of helping people understand of, okay, I want to graze grasses. That's my goal, is to reduce my fine fuels, my grasses. You don't necessarily need to get goats. you can get sheep or cows. So helping them to understand what's the best species for that vegetation you're managing. And then ability beyond just that map to get a list. So you can have both. You can look at the map, but also you could just go to a list that maybe could be searchable by a zip code or a county kind of a thing. And so that's what we're kind of looking at. That's how we're going to advance it as well. And then these additional resources that we need, a better understanding of natural resource and land goals, because we have a lot of people of wealth that buy land. And they, particularly what they do first is remove the grazing animals because they have to be bad, right? And then they get encroachment of the brush, and then we have a fire issue, and then they're very concerned about getting the animals back. And so helping to even stop that from even starting, to help them to keep the animals there. A really key piece that I think from a long-term sustainability piece is the infrastructure. So I think targeted grazing has a place. It's great. But in California, when you're paying $1,000 an acre for targeted grazers, it's not the most sustainable from a landowner perspective. So if you want to reduce your fire fuels and your brush management, targeted grazing is a place to start. Then from a long-term perspective, maybe you want to put in infrastructure so you have perimeter fencing and water development, so that either you can bring a grazer back and there's no charge, or that grazer starts paying you for the use of that property. So looking at how do we create infrastructure leases, if you will, so that if you help the landowner, you being the grazer, help the landowner put up fences, you now have a long-term lease of 15 to 20 years that helps you amortize the cost of that fence. And so you're guaranteed that area to graze. And so understanding the cost and benefit ratio of grazing, there is a cost to it, but there's obviously a benefit for many, many reasons. And then understanding the species to use, which you can use all three. And then the timing of grazing, so understanding and working with the timing and the different aspects of other species to protect. So if you have nesting birds, it's difficult to get in there at a time when the brush might be the most nutritional. And so how do we balance that, the nutritional needs of the grazing animals versus on the special status species that are also on that land? And then this whole idea about leases and request for proposals. So we get a lot of public land folks that you have to fill out a request for proposal. And so helping grazers to better understand, one, how to do a lease or how to bid a property, and so that it becomes economically viable for them. And then how to fill out these requests for proposals. So that helps them as well. And so we'll have on the website now a guide to filling out your grazing proposals. And that also, we're going to expand that to have you to sell your story, how to market yourself, and how to create like opportunities to partner with a landowner long-term, either working through folks like NRCS from getting equip grants or implementing practices that's going to benefit the overall production of that land. So final thoughts is that all properties are different. All grazers are different, and so there's not one size fits all. It's not a cookbook kind of thing. So helping people to understand what's the best way, what's the best species, what's the best time to implement grazing as one of our management tools. And maybe grazing's not the first tool you use, or maybe you've already burned. And so it's this opportunity of how to balance, if you're going to use mechanical and create shaded fuel breaks, then the long-term management of those shaded fuel breaks is with grazing. Or if you've already done a prescribed burn, then the long-term management of that is with grazing. Because we're not going to use all the tools all the time, but I think we're going to use grazing all the tools as the time. And so with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. And thank you for that opportunity. Yeah.
If you ever get tired of living in California, we would love to have you in Texas.
Ooh, thank you.
Or Kansas.
We could use this program in Texas.
I would love to be able to expand this program, because what we're seeing is folks from Nevada are kind of, I've got people in Nevada and Oregon that are tapping into that. We do. So yeah, because we do move around. You could start a dating service in Texas. I'm sure the Texans would love that. Yeah.
Just to give credit where credit is due, you got this from South Dakota.
I did.
Where did South Dakota get theirs from?
I think they created it.
They did not.
Oh, do tell.
I created it.
You did? That's wonderful.
This was originally created and funded by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and South Dakota reached out to us, and we gave them the code, and they gave the code to you, and we're seeing expansion of it from Minnesota to, there's actually now a Midwest grazing exchange that covers much of the, it covers Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, I think Indiana, and Iowa, and that one's run by the Practical Farmers of Iowa.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I
I'm
did not
sorry,
know
I
that.
just had to point that out.
No, I think that's great. I mean, I think we need to tell that story because that just expands it more.
And it wasn't totally by idea. It was a compilation between some NRCS folks and the Sustainable Farming Association.
It's wonderful. That's great. Yes.
That is great.
Thank you
Very much.
Okay.
That was very educational. And the tricky part is being the matchmaker.
Wait, I forgot because you started it. There you go. I will wear it. Yes, thank you. Because you think I could do good in Texas?
If you ever have a Texas say they don't want California.
Make America great again. Thank you.
Are you ready?
Check, check, 1, 2, 3, sounds like it. Y'all hear me good? Can I get a Yahoo, anybody? Huh? Uh-oh.
You got to be green. You're turned off.
I am thoroughly turned on now.
All right.